Okay. Welcome to this third day of the IEEE IoT Vertical and Topical Summit at RWW 2021. We have had two fairly exciting days of presentations. Today we have three speakers. They are Bahman Badipur from the Federal Communications Commission, Martin Zoltick from Rothwell Figg, which is a legal firm, and Janice McNair from the University of Florida. You know, as a technical community, we sometimes worry just about the technology. There are many other aspects to the Internet of Things, and in fact, the main topic of the summit, which is sensors and communications. Today, I think we're going to be discussing that particular dimension. I think what's important on the FCC side is the spectrum and the rules around it that we can use, both for communications and for sensors. Marty is going to talk about the legal side of things. And I think Janice is going to talk about the accompanying aspect of it, which is how do you provide security for things up and down the spectrum of the kind of devices that we see in IoT. Let me just ask the following for our speakers. We're going to start off with Bahman, and I'm shortly going to pass him the ball. Talk should be roughly half an hour, and then we'll do questions in the panel. But what I'd like to do is ask our other speakers to go on mute and actually turn off their videos so we don't consume bandwidth on that. Okay? So with that, what I'm going to ask is, Bahman, I'm about to pass the ball to you. If you could also do a little bit of a introduction, and then just get right into your presentation.
Okay. Good morning. My name is Bahman Badipur, and I'm with the Office of Engineering and Technology at the FCC. I've been at the FCC for about 7 years, and it's great to be here with you this morning. The title of my talk is Spectrum for Sensors in the Age of Automation and IoT. We are living in the age of communication, information, and connectivity. I think we can all agree that connectivity has become part of our culture. Smartphones with 4G, 5G technologies are in the marketplace, and 6G is on the horizon. People can easily find socks, shirts, and other wearable devices with sensors. Homes are becoming smarter, using technologies ranging from Zigbee controlled blinders to smart thermostat for energy efficiency. At a large scale, cities are trying to become smarter with local policies supporting innovators. Self-driving cars for delivery, drones also require spectrum for sensors and have been a source of innovation in recent years. Sensors not only use spectrum for sensing, but they also require spectrum for connectivity. The Commission has been at work very diligently to keep up with the industry and innovators. Sorry, let me start with our 5G plan initiative, where we have been working on low frequency 600 megahertz, mid-frequency band CBRS, C-band, and 6 gigahertz, and high frequency band, Spectrum Frontier and Spectrum Horizons. All to ensure that we are the global leader in 5G. The low frequency spectrum is efficient for providing coverage but the high spectrum is better suited for higher throughput. Our goal is to provide additional spectrum in low, mid, and high frequency band, and let the market determine the best use of the spectrum. Let me expand on this a little more. The low band, the 600 gigahertz band, has been allocated by the FCC for wireless broadband, 35 megahertz up, 35 megahertz down, using FDD. Also, there is an 11 megahertz gap, duplex gap, which is utilized for unlicensed use, including unlicensed microphones. The band has been already auctioned and 4G network has been built and being upgraded to 5G networks. CBRS has a new opportunity to utilize database management, spectrum access system, SAS, to enable the spectrum between Navy radars and commercial use. After multiple years of collaboration with federal agencies, the auction was concluded in September 2020. The 3.7 to 4.2 gigahertz band adopted in February adds mobile allocation to this band. Makes 280 megahertz of spectrum available for flexible use. Requires FSS operations to relocate to upper 200 megahertz band, the portion of the band, provide incumbent FSS and FS licenses with reimbursement, and adopts service and technical rules for flexible use licenses in the 288 megahertz of the spectrum designated for transition to flexible use. The flexible use licenses can use this spectrum in any application. Bidding in auction 107 is ongoing right now. The 6 gigahertz report and order made 1200 megahertz available for unlicensed use. In the Uni 5 and Uni 7 bands, access point could transmit indoors and outdoors under control of an AFC system at 36 dBm. In the Uni 5 through Uni 8 bands, access point could operate at lower power without an AFC system, restricted to indoor use only. Client devices must be under control of an access point. These could be IoT sensors. The FMPRM proposed to permit very low power operation indoors and outdoors across the entire 6 gigahertz band. The Spectrum Frontier report and order added 12.55 gigahertz of spectrum for mobile services, of which 7 gigahertz is for unlicensed use. The service rules are covered in Part 30, which includes technical rules, band plan, license terms, and performance requirements. We have received significant interest in the unlicensed portion of this band for sensor application. The rules for the unlicensed portion of this band are in Part 15.255. In the Spectrum Horizon report and order, FCC expanded access to bands above 95 gigahertz. A total of 21.2 gigahertz for unlicensed use. The rules are similar to the 60 gigahertz band rules. The bands selected are high absorption bands allowing for reuse. The report and order also includes new type of experimental licenses for bands greater than 95 gigahertz. These licenses include longer license terms, ability to sell license, and permit expanded market trials over 95 gigahertz. As the industry gets more familiarized with the above 95 gigahertz bands, it may recognize the potential opportunities that exist in very wide unlicensed bands for sensors. we can categorize radars in three groups: long range, mid-range, and short range. Traditional radars typically transmit upward of megawatts. Because of this high power transmit and receive sensitivity, their interference protection and coordination are more difficult to engineer. These radars are allocated across the spectrum band, including L-band, C-band, X-band, and K-band. We also have a few blocks of spectrum for navigation and radio navigation purposes. 76 to 81 gigahertz band has been utilized in many automakers to provide various radar needs for automotive applications, which we will be discussed further in the next slide. These radars typically operate under 1,000 watts or less and have low duty cycles to coexist with other vehicular radars. We also have two blocks of the spectrum for detect and avoid, used by drones or UAS, namely 24 gigahertz band and 15 gigahertz band. These radars are also typically operate under 1,000 watts and detect the incoming UAS to avoid collision. Then we have several provisions under Part 15 that can be used for sensing, including the 60 gigahertz band, with transmit powers less than a few hundred milliwatts. For ultra-wideband, the output power is limited to microwatts. According to Highway Traffic Safety Administration, the automakers consider radar an important contributing sensor for meeting new safety requirements in developing autonomous vehicles. Some of the long-range radar applications include collision avoidance and adaptive cruise control. Short-range radar application includes autonomous braking, firing of restraint systems, and pedestrian detection. Narrowband radar applications include blind spot detection, lane change assistance. Ultrasonic sensor is for braking parking distance control. Both long-range radar and short-range radar are under Part 95, Subpart M of the FCC. Narrowband radar is under Part 15, and ultrasonic is under Part 18. Certification of wideband vehicular radars under Part 15.252 and ultra-wideband vehicular radar under Part 15.515 is terminated after September 20, 2018. We have received several waiver requests in this band for applications other than vehicular radar. An example of granted waiver request is cited later in the presentation. An active waiver under consideration is for in-cabin use of the 76 to 81 gigahertz band for detection of child left behind. Similar waiver requests are also under review in the 60 gigahertz band, which is discussed further in the presentation. Ultra-wideband rules, Part 15, Subpart F, identify a number of specific use cases, with each use case having a slightly different emission mask. Ground penetrating radar and wall penetrating radars must be licensed and is limited to public safety, scientific research, commercial, mining, or construction. The use of true wall imaging system is limited to state or public safety organization and must be licensed. Surveillance system operation must be licensed and is limited to public safety, manufacturers, petroleum, and power licenses. Medical imaging systems may be operated by or under supervision of licensed healthcare providers. Indoor ultra-wideband system may not be used outdoors. License for short-range communication like home applications. This band is intended for short-range communication for home video distribution and wireless computer interconnection. Handheld ultra-wideband devices are primarily handheld while being operated, requiring no infrastructure. Applications include such devices as video, still cameras with wireless links to computer or other electronic equipment. UWB technology has been around for nearly 20 years since the FCC adopted this unlicensed use. We continue to receive waiver requests for UWB. Applications range from imaging, radar, to real-time location tracking. From policy perspective, the UWB rules were carefully crafted to ensure that there won't be harmful interference to the incumbent users, including both federal and non-federal users. We will continue to balance the benefits of UWB technology against the interference concerns to the incumbent users. In 2016, the Commission adopted rules for radar in the 60 GHz band. The short-range interactive motion sensing device allows users to interact with hand gestures, device at short distance away without needing to touch the device itself. In 2018, FCC granted a request by Google for a waiver of Section 15.255C3 for rules governing short-range interactive motion sensing devices. The Google SOLI waiver allows the device to operate in the 57 to 64 GHz band at the maximum 13 dBm EIRP, 10 dBm transmitter conductive output, and 13 dBm per megahertz power spectral density. Operate on onboard aircraft while not being part of the closed onboard communication network within the aircraft. Operate with maximum duty cycle of 10% in the 33 millisecond interval, but still has to meet other prohibitions specified in this section. We have received a number of Me Too waivers requests to permit devices to operate in the same spectrum at the same power level and on the same duty cycle as the SOLI sensor. Applications include detection of child left behind, seatbelt reminder, driver attention, intrusion and theft prevention, detection of heart rate, and other physical condition changes, and detection of unmoving obstacles. The Technological Advisory Council has recognized the importance of radar application and in September of 2020 recommended to start rulemaking proceedings to examine 60 GHz rules and to address issues raised by waiver requests for field disturbance systems. We are considering power levels for radar application, including potential for equivalent power levels to communication systems for listen before talk radar, coexistence and other coexistence mechanisms, including duty cycle requirements, dynamic frequency selection, and contention-based protocols. Part 15 waiver. As you may know, certification will only be granted for devices that have demonstrated compliance with all applicable Commission rules. If, however, specific rules cannot be met, applicant can submit a request for waiver. A waiver request must demonstrate good cause, generally involves public notice, and may include special grant conditions to submit with the applicant for certification. Let me now review some of the waiver grants that we have granted recently. Rothwell Shorts has a security scanner system designed to detect the presence of concealed metallic and non-metallic threats. They require waivers of Section 15.205, restricted bands, 15.209, field strength limits. This waiver was granted in September of 2020. Metron required waiver of UWD rules for their system designed to prevent collisions between trains, overspeed derailments, unauthorized train movement in work zones, and to minimize human error. This waiver was granted in October 2020. Piper required a waiver of UWD rules for their enhanced transit location system, designed to provide position information for trains, prevent train-to-train collision, and identify unauthorized train movement in work zones. This waiver was granted in November of 2020. MIT required waiver of UWD rules for their Y-track system passively monitoring mobility, breathing, and other physiological signals in patients without body-worn sensors. This waiver was granted in April 2020. Sensible medical innovations require waivers of UWB rules for their system designed to measure lung fluid measurements in congestive heart failure patients. This waiver was granted in September of 2019. This concludes my presentation. I thank you for the opportunity.
Bahman, thank you. And that was quite a display of applications, many of them related to IoT. So I think we'll come back to these issues in the panel. I'm looking at the Q&A box, so we don't have anything other than a question from Tom McKay, who asked, will these slides be made available for download? And Tom, the answer is yes, we will be doing that. Okay, so I think with that, let's move on to our second speaker today. It's Marty Zoltick from Rothwell Figg, and he's been at with us at a summit before. So let me see whether I can move the ball to Marty. Let's see, right here. Okay. Okay, so Marty, you're the presenter. If you could say a few words about your background, introduce yourself.
Sure.
And get right into the presentation. And if you could put that into presentation mode. Super. Okay, it's all yours.
Thanks, Adam, and hi, everyone. And thank you for joining the session. I'm a technology lawyer. I've been practicing about 30 years. I'm a partner at a Washington, D.C.-based law firm in the U.S. Called Rothwell Figg. My practice focuses primarily on intellectual property, transactions, and privacy, data protection, and cybersecurity. So before I went to law school, I have a computer science degree, and before I went to law school, I was a practicing software engineer working in areas of telecommunications and artificial intelligence. So my practice really is at the intersection of the intellectual property, new technologies that I work on, and the privacy, data protection, and cybersecurity legal considerations. So that's a bit about me. The title of the presentation is Feeling Insecure, what the IoT community needs to know to navigate the evolving legal and regulatory landscape around reasonable security features for IoT and connected devices. So this is an area that's evolving incredibly quickly, and I have basically tried to include in the presentation the most current developments in the area in the U.S. Europe, and the UK. See if I can get this to move. So I divided the presentation into 3 different areas. Just to kind of set the stage, IoT and connected devices technology use cases. I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but thought it would be helpful to sort of identify what it is the legal and regulatory framework is applicable to. Then I'm going to get into the laws and regulations surrounding these types of devices. I'm going to spend a little bit of time, again, setting the stage and talking about some of the more comprehensive privacy laws that are in place that also are applicable. But then I'm going to focus on the more recent laws that are specifically directed to these types of devices. And then I'll finish up with talking about some best practices and building a compliance program and a framework for risk management. So, I think it's pretty self-evident probably to this audience, why we're talking about this, why it's an area that is of such consideration right now. Massive growth in the number of IoT devices that are deployed. We've done some work around the AI-enabled technologies in these types of devices, and that's giving rise to even more concerns regarding security, privacy, bias, that kind of thing. It's very challenging, from the legal and regulatory perspective, and so it is a major focus and is sort of, I'll say, demanding changes and new regulations and laws to apply these types of devices. At the heart of it is the vast amounts of data, and in particular, personal data. You've probably heard the terminology PII. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but these types of devices are generating and collecting and transmitting and storing and processing, massive amounts of this type of data, and it creates significant challenges. And all of this has, as I said, caused regulators and policymakers and also the public to take notice. The other sort of aspect of it that I think about that I think gives rise to everyone out there at all levels, from government to individuals, taking notice is the data breaches that have been occurring and are more, I guess, newsworthy these days than in the past. There's a website that I became aware of that sort of keeps track of all these things. And one thing that was surprising to me when I actually started looking at this website is that there's a lot more, what I would say, fairly significant data breaches that you don't hear about. So the bottom line is this has created an increasing lack of trust, sort of top to bottom, I think, from individuals up to the highest levels in government, policymakers, and so on. The specific concerns that are the focus of the reasons that are given as to why new laws and rules and regulations are being put into place relate to the security vulnerabilities in these types of devices, the automatic decision-making capabilities, the fact that there's limited user interface capability in these types of devices, and then lastly, the fact that these devices are being integrated into larger information systems and infrastructure, and having the security vulnerability not only impacts the device itself, but can impact the broader system and infrastructure. So again, all this is driving this increased focus all the way around. In terms of the devices themselves that are the subject of the legislation and the laws and the use cases, I'm going to talk about the Internet of Things Cybersecurity Information Improvement Act of 2020, which was just passed in December. So it's very recent, and I thought it useful to provide the definition of Internet of Things devices in that legislation. There are, one of the issues we deal with in terms of evaluating the legal landscape are the differing definitions that are provided in, the federal law, the state law, in the U.S., in Europe, and in other countries, and trying to, when you're dealing with an IoT device manufacturer, or user in that sense, that's trying to assess the legal landscape, it's challenging in some sense to have to deal with all the different definitions. But this definition I wanted to put because it's sort of the most current view in the U.S. in any case. So I've included it in the slides here, but it's broad. You have at least one transducer, sensor, or actuator for interacting directly with the physical world. Have at least one network interface, and it excludes conventional information technology devices, smartphones, laptops, and so on, and then can function on their own, and are not only able to function when acting as a component of another device, such as a processor. So, sort of when I do these talks, I try and think about my own surroundings, my house, not my office right now, but in my house, and I just, in a few minutes, my Ring doorbell, my electronic front door lock, my electronic water meter, my electronic gas meter, my garage door openers, my Alexa devices, which are all over the place, my electronic shades. We had some new appliances. The refrigerator has an app, my smartwatch, my fitness tracker, my smart TVs, my thermostats, my lighting. I got a drone for, a holiday. In any case, and there's more. All those types of devices would fit into this definition. And again, the sort of broader categories of consideration in the use cases are the devices themselves, what type of device management, the connectivity and networking, and of course the security. And just give some examples here. I'm going to, in the interest of time, kind of move forward. And this is from NIST. I'm going to get into NIST's role in the legal privacy cybersecurity landscape. But again, I think this is also kind of a helpful graphic of IoT devices, and in particular, considering the IoT device manufacturers on the one hand, the IoT device customers on the other hand, and what should inform the considerations in designing those devices, deploying those devices, and then monitoring those devices. Let me dive into the legal and regulatory framework. Again, and this is also from NIST, which I think is helpful, and it's a sort of a sort of more generic, I'll say, view, but it holds, which is you've got on the one hand the cybersecurity laws, regulation, and the regulatory guidance is being provided, and then on the other hand, you've got the existing guidelines and guidance and so on, and considering the customer's goals and needs all sort of drop down into the IoT device manufacturer's lap in a sense in terms of what needs to be thought through in designing, developing, and deploying these devices. So as I mentioned, if I had 8 hours, I could get into all the ins and outs of these various reports that have been generated. I'm going to get into a little bit of the requirements of this new act, the Internet of Things Cybersecurity Improvement Act. But my point here is there's a lot going on. It's very current. As I said, this act was just, so let me take a brief step back. In the U.S., in any case, we don't have a comprehensive federal privacy law. The states have sort of taken it into their own hands, California being the first to have comprehensive privacy laws that apply, to the state, which affect, the rest of the United States, and we can talk a little bit about the scope. But in this particular IoT area, and I'm going to get into it briefly, we've got states also issuing technology-specific laws that apply to IoT and connected devices. So now I would say kind of the first time in this arena, in any case, we have the beginnings of a federal privacy law relating specifically to IoT and IoT devices, limited to, in this case, those IoT devices that are deployed with the federal government and federal agencies. But the import of all this is that all of this work is sort of going to lead back to the consideration that we deal with clients, which is, am I satisfying the requirements of whatever applicable laws, rules, and regulations of having reasonable security features? And how do I figure out what is a reasonable security feature? And this guidance, which is going to come from this Act, and NIST under the Act is required to set forth the core baseline and the ins and outs of what's going to be required, is going to, in my view, sort of be the guidance that we've all been looking for to try and demonstrate to whatever regulators are evaluating your IoT device and its deployment, to be able to establish that what you've done is reasonable. In other words, satisfies that reasonable security features metric. And so the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, is issued a number of different, I'll say, guidance, guidelines, reports, and so on, beginning, they've been doing it for the last several years, but, most recently this workshop report for building the federal profile for IoT device cybersecurity in January of 21, and then I'll get into some of these other publications in a bit. I mentioned, so that's federal. I mentioned state. California, effective January 2020, has a Security of Connected Devices law that's in place. Oregon is another state that has a very similar law, and there's legislation that's currently in consideration in a number of other states in the country, which I've listed here. There are 3 states that have comprehensive state privacy laws. I wanted to also mention, in terms of this, sort of guidance and what you can look to try and ensure that if you're in a situation, you can establish reasonable security features. Industry groups have also issued guidelines and recommendations for best practices, and notwithstanding applicable laws, there are a number of companies that are self-regulating by agreeing to comply with guidelines and recommendations. I wanted to just touch briefly on the EU and the UK. It's I'll say somewhat similar to where we now are in the U.S. at the federal level, putting the states to the side. The EU has always dealt with it in a with an EU-centric approach, and has issued what I think are excellent guidelines to try and ensure that IoT devices and connected devices meet the standards for reasonable security measures and features. I've listed what are the sort of more current guidelines and frameworks in the EU. They have a certification, European cybersecurity certification framework that's in place, and there's a sort of recent mandate that is sort of strengthening that requirement and providing additional guidance. But again, it's sort of similar to what we see happening in the U.S. And then the UK as well, not a law yet, but a proposal for regulating these types of devices with similar considerations relating to baseline and codes of practice for these types of devices. And I should mention too that in the EU as well as the UK, the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, which is their version of a federal all-encompassing comprehensive law, covers these devices as well. So they already have a law that kind of more of an umbrella law that relates to these devices, which we don't have at a federal level in the U.S. So privacy and data protection, just to kind of set the stage. And again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to be able to get into all of this, but it's included. When we're talking about what the concern is here, we're talking about information privacy, and what I mentioned is personally identifiable information that, in connection with these IoT and connected devices, is collected and used and processed and stored and maybe disclosed or maybe sold, and how long is it going to be retained for? Is it going to be deleted? And then the concepts which we see in the current laws relating to, is the end user or the user, maybe a B2B type situation, being provided with notice and being given a choice to consent or opt out to disclosure of that information, sale of that information, and so on. And when we think about data protection in terms of the cycle, we think about, the handling, storage, and managing that information. What kind of security and quality controls are in place with respect to that information? What's the life cycle from collection to destruction, and what kind of management, administration, monitoring, and enforcement processes are in place? And all of these sort of general high-level themes, I think, sort of permeate through the more specific laws and rules and regulations and guidance associated with IoT and connected devices. Just to mention, as I said, these different laws and legislation have different definitions. When you think of PII at a very high, basic level, you're talking about information which can be used to distinguish or trace an individual's identity, like a name or social security number, so on. The GDPR has a definition of personal data that includes, expressly in that definition, location data, online identifier. And then if we get to the CCPA, the California Comprehensive Privacy Law, it expands beyond the concept of just a consumer, or what they call in Europe a data subject, to a household, which then implicates all these types of devices that, sure, they may be associated with a consumer, but they may not be. They may be really deployed by, the electric company or the gas company or some other company. So bringing in the concept of the household, sort of implicates, I think, additional coverage. And then it also specifically refers to personal identifiers, personal information being included, like an online IP address, as well as, internet or other electronic network activity as being personal or personal information. And that then invokes these applicable laws, for example, in California. I just included this because there are levels of personal information. Obviously, there's more sensitive personal information, for example, like, biometric data that if breached, you can't really order some new biometric data like you can get a new driver's license number. And then there are concepts that try and take what otherwise would be considered personal information and sort of remove it from the definition, like anonymized or aggregated data, and then pseudonymized data, which is kind of a gray area. I mentioned this before, but just to say briefly that, in a number of countries like the EU or Brazil, India, Japan, they have comprehensive privacy laws. We don't have that in the US. We don't have a single comprehensive federal law. We have a number of federal agencies that regulate privacy. However, the FTC being, in my view, kind of the most, having sort of the broadest scope in terms of its ability to deal with privacy and data protection and cybersecurity issues. And then at the state level, the attorneys general, and there are some also private rights of action, but they're limited, and it's an issue. So I mentioned the 3 states that have comprehensive privacy laws. California, they're very current. California, Maine, and Nevada. I included in the materials a link to the IAPP State Comprehensive Privacy Law Comparison. It's really an excellent guide to keeping up to date on what's going on in the states with comprehensive privacy laws. And then that link is to a fairly specific chart, and I always like visuals, so this kind of shows you where things are with comprehensive privacy laws, and that there's a number of states that have had bills that have been introduced and some that are in process right now, but only 3 that have actually adopted those laws. And again, this is in part because we don't have a comprehensive federal privacy law, so you see the states, getting going on it. I want to talk specifically in a little more detail about this IoT Cybersecurity Improvement Act. As I said, it's going to establish what are the minimum security standards for IoT devices that are owned or controlled by the federal government. It says, and for other purposes. It's unclear to me exactly what that may be applicable to, but we're sort of interpreting it as IoT devices that are owned or controlled by the federal government. I don't have time in my 30 minutes to get into all the details, but what I want to say is that there's going to be developed, adopted, and implemented security standards for these IoT devices if you want to do business with the federal government. NIST is charged under the Act with doing it. NIST has as I had indicated before, kind of a body of work that they already have put together, which is excellent. They're going to be, reassessing that, and I take it most likely updating it in some way, shape, or form, and publishing a first set of security standards and guidelines March 4, 2021. So coming up soon. We'll have to, obviously keep an eye on that. And then the standards and guidelines that are finalized will be incorporated into the federal government information security policies and principles, as well as federal acquisition regulations by September 4, 2021. So certainly any IoT manufacturer or company that is sort of, integrating with IoT devices and so on that's doing business with the federal government needs to keep a very watchful eye on this and what's going on. I had mentioned NIST and what they're doing. I've got some details in here which gives the specific information on the NIST documents of interest so that you can refer to them. They're very detailed, but they're excellent in terms of providing guidance in a very systematic and clear way. There are drafts that were recently issued in December 2020, sort of to coincide, I think, with the Act, that update some prior documents and give some more information on the core baseline for these types of devices from both a technical standpoint and a non-technical standpoint, and then kind of a documentation, integration, reporting requirements regarding potential security vulnerabilities and so on. So I just included this to say that the objective, if you will, the mission in the end has to do with the development and applications of standards, guidelines, and related tools to improve the cybersecurity of connected devices and environments in which they are deployed. So this is what NIST is focused on, and yeah, it's for the federal government, but in my view, it's a sort of going to be probably the gold standard of what can be used by IoT manufacturers and considered by others in connection with using IoT devices. In terms of the core baseline, and this is also being updated, but I wanted to include this because I think it's going to be the sort of core of recommended security features that manufacturers should consider and build into IoT devices. Device identification, device configuration, data protection, logical access to interfaces, software and firmware updates, and cybersecurity event logging. Again, if I had more time, I could go into this in some more detail, but these need to be, in my view, kind of top of mind considerations in connection with assessing, whether or not there's reasonable security features in, your IoT and connected device. California, Oregon, I mentioned, have these specific laws related to IoT and connected devices. I've included the definitions that are used, and as you can, for example, this is in the California law. It refers to and covers manufacturers of connected devices, and you can see the definitions are very, very broad. Manufacturer, the person who manufactures or contracts with another person to manufacture on the person's behalf connected devices that are sold or offered for sale in California. So, that covers, I'm sure, a very, very large percentage of all companies that manufacture IoT devices and sell them or offer them for sale. Again, the definition of connected device here is very broad. Any device or other physical object that is capable of connecting to the internet directly or indirectly, and that is assigned an IP address or Bluetooth address. So very broad coverage. We get a little bit of help in let me say this has not been interpreted yet. So, the trick with legal issues are, you have a law, bill, legislation that says something, and you read it, and you might think you know what it means, but in the end, there's usually a body of, there's either guidance provided by the entity that is issued the law, or by, through enforcement, where courts or agencies are interpreting it. So the California law gives us some guidance on reasonable security feature or features that must be included, or that the IoT device or connected device must be equipped with. It has to be all of these things. Appropriate to the nature and function of the device, appropriate to the information it may collect, contain, or transmit, designed to protect the device and any information contained therein from unauthorized access, destruction, use, modification, or disclosure. So there's a lot of questions, I think, about what this actually means, and it's going to be interpreted. And then it may be sort of ambiguous or broad by design. And then there is some help within the California law that says if a connected device is equipped with a means for authentication outside a local area network, it shall be deemed a reasonable security feature under subdivision A, which we just looked at, if either of the following requirements are met. The pre-programmed password is unique to each device manufactured. The device contains a security feature that requires a user to generate a new means of authentication before access is granted to the device for the first time. So we have some guidance here, but it's still unclear exactly how this is going to be interpreted, and also what exactly the interplay will be with this section and the previous section. As I said, Oregon is similar. It is different in the sense, or narrow in the sense, that it is really talking about use for personal, family, or household purposes, whereas the California law is much broader and includes business purposes as well. I've included in the materials what I think is a very helpful and somewhat detailed but concise identification of baseline security recommendations. This is from the EU guidelines. And I think it has a very nice sort of systematic outline of the phases, from sort of start to implementation and deployment of an IoT device, and the corresponding security considerations that need to be addressed throughout. This is part of the same sort of package in the EU guidance. And then I want to finish up. I know I'm just about at 30 minutes, just to say that it's important, and clearly more important now than ever to establish, best practices and some kind of framework to manage risk in connection with, an IoT device manufacturer, for some entity that's going to integrate an IoT device, embed an IoT device, or use an IoT device. Aside from the shut this off. Aside from the for obvious reasons, and I tried to include in here sort of a stepwise approach that can be followed at a kind of a sort of basic level based on what we just discussed and considered. Reviewing the regulatory landscape, developing some review framework within the company to get input from, and it's not just input from the developers, it's input from legal, from tech, from marketing, from the internal group who may be dealing with processing of data and so on. Initiating a security assessment, privacy by design, and then the requirement for continuous compliance monitoring. And then I concluded with some slides, which I'm not going to get into, that provide, a sort of a stepwise approach for best practices for compliance with applicable laws relating to privacy issues.
Okay.
So thank you.
So Marty, thank you. I have to say, for the technical community, we sometimes just wonder about the functionality of devices. So having all of this levied on us is quite a heavy burden. But we do have a few questions for you. And so before we go on to our next speaker, who's Janice, let me actually sort of deal with a couple of those. The first one is from Walter Johnston. And his question is the following. The EU seems more concerned regarding protection of consumers/privacy rights, while U.S. seems focused more on cybersecurity. Notice agreements more focused on immunity for service providers, simply impossible for consumers to make dozens and hundreds of judgments. Okay?
Yes.
So if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I think the underpinning of a lot of the focus, I think, goes back to what we think about personal information that is collected. And in Europe, from the very beginning, years ago, when they started thinking about what became GDPR, the thought process, was that, individual consumers, called data subjects, it's their personal information and they own it, regardless of whether it's being collected from some device and being, transmitted or stored or processed or sold and so on. They own it. And so I think that law was, from the beginning, sort of designed to protect the consumer, the data subject. Whereas in the U.S., we have not traditionally treated personal information that way, in the sense of we don't seem to have a recognition that the individual, owns the personal information. So if you consider that, and my personal information is sitting in Facebook or sitting in some healthcare company or sitting in some utility, then you're dealing with them. And the sort of way that we, I think, under our laws, rules, and regulations deal with an entity like that is different than the way we would deal with an individual consumer.
Okay. So that's one dimension, but just taking off of Walter's question, I find to some extent in the EU, there is a greater mistrust of private entities versus the U.S., where there is a mistrust of governmental entities.
Yes.
That's all you got to say. Okay. Okay.
Well, these policies are, in the end, these policies are getting put into place with all the way our system works, right? various considerations, which is probably why we haven't seen a federal privacy law.
Yeah. So, Walter, you're now live. Do you want to elaborate on your question?
Well, I'm very depressed now because you've told me I've either got to put my faith in Mark Zuckerberg or Donald Trump, and I'm really at a loss.
Okay.
I don't want to talk about either of those.
Yeah, thank you very much for making my day.
Thank you, Walter. Okay. So let me do the next person. I think Tim Zimmerlin had a few observations and some questions. So Tim, if you could very briefly ask your priority question, you're on live right now. Okay, Tim?
Hey, Adam, can you take off my screen share?
I think you have to do that. You can say stop sharing.
Stop sharing. There we go. Got it. Thank you. Good.
All right. So let me actually. Tim says he has no mic. Okay. So let me just read off a few of his questions. So the first one was, Marty, for us non-lawyers, please address liability, safe harbor, and what do you think the upcoming congressional intent is for IoT?
Okay.
Okay. And by the way, I just want to interject. We had Congresswoman Del Bene, who has actually had a lot to do with the legislation. We are likely to have her at one of our other events, which will be the World Forum in New Orleans. Okay, but go ahead.
In terms of liability, we're sort of now starting to get a better idea on what the liability may be. But I have to say, in California, for example, when we looked at that, we don't have the federal law, but in California, there is no specification or indication of what liability might be if you violate that IoT Security of Connected Devices law. So, and there's no private right of action. So it would be an attorney general. I suspect there will be some kind of fine. If they use the model of the CCPA, there you can have some real exposure because there they look at the number, for example, the number of records, or if there's a breach, and it's like, I think it's $7,500 a record. So if you have thousands or hundreds of thousands of records in a data breach, you could be looking at a serious fine. At a federal level, you have the FTC, and they've had a number of investigations, many or most of which have settled, where the company will pay a fine. And, to be honest with you, I think that when you look at the companies that they target, which are big, huge companies, and you look at the fine, it seems relatively minor, like a real slap on the wrist, if that. But the other part of the resolution is more substantial, which is years of monitoring to ensure that there is compliance and elimination of the security vulnerabilities that led to the issue, the breach. In the EU, the liability is more defined because under the GDPR, there are specific measure, like 4% of revenue. I don't have the exact. It's 4% of revenue, and then there's a cap, but it's very, very significant. And the EU has been fairly aggressive. The authorities in the different countries in the EU have been fairly aggressive in terms of enforcing the GDPR. So that's the liability exposure in the EU. Safe harbor, there are exceptions in the various applicable laws, rules, and regulations that can get you out from under. As I mentioned, some of it is sort of looking at the definitions, for example, of personal information, and being able to say that you don't fall under the applicable law. And then it's not safe harbor, but your sort of best, what we're advising is the best practice is to be able to defend that you implemented reasonable security measures. And if there is a violation after that, then you can demonstrate reasonable security measures in accordance with one of these guidelines that are accepted. There shouldn't be, liability. If there is, it shouldn't be, substantial.
Yeah. So, Marty, let's do the following. I think we're going to go on to our next speaker, and then what I would like to do is bring back some of Tim Zimmerlin's questions into the panel discussion. Okay?
Yes.
So I think, Janice, you're all set to go. I've passed the ball to you. Let's see whether we can unmute you and get you going. Okay, and Janice is, go ahead.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. I'm halfway there. I want to see if my screen will come up.
Okay. And Janice is actually going to be talking about sort of the counterpart to what Marty just discussed. You have to have reasonable security. How do you do it for the hard devices that are out there? So, okay.
All right. Is it showing yet?
Nope.
Okay.
There it is. It's come. There you go. Okay, and if you can put that in presentation mode, super. You're all on, and I'm going to go and mute. Okay?
Okay, great.
Yeah, and
thank you for. Oh, go ahead.
No, what I was going to say is if you could do a brief introduction, that would be great, and then get into the presentation. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you, first of all, Adam, for inviting me to speak at the IoT Summit. It's a very exciting area involving a lot of different, applications, a lot of different considerations. So I imagine these will go on for quite some time. And my name is Jenny McNair. I'm a associate professor and PhD at the University of Florida in the electrical and computer engineering department. So I could have one foot in electrical and computing and one foot in computer science because I operate at sort of the higher layers of the protocol stack for those of you who are network familiar, meaning we do network problems, multimedia problems, security problems at the higher layers. So today I'm going to talk about networking and the kind of data that's collected by different applications and 3 applications in particular, and talk about how these new areas have to now consider how to manage a network without having many network experts working in the environment or on these problems. And on this first slide, I have my lab website here in case you want to find out more information about what we do. So I am, as I mentioned, in the networking layer, which includes a lot of Internet of Things studies. And Internet of Things is a system, just to define it, even though we've heard it a couple of times for this presentation, but I'll zero it out. So in terms of my research, Internet of Things is a communication system where the Internet connects the physical world with users using via sensors that are ubiquitous and cover the entire physical environment. So it's almost like having Internet everywhere. So instead of saying I'm going to turn on my laptop and access the Internet, now the Internet is always with you. The physical world objects called things can consist of any object from a lamp to a bottle of water to a refrigerator to a makeup case. Anything you can imagine can be networked based on the technological advances we're having these days. So there's near constant information exchange, whether we want it or not. And there's, you may have noticed there's near constant data collection and analyzing. So if you are a person that uses Facebook and you have a conversation with your friend about your car, then you might see these advertisements for cars coming up on your Facebook page. Or if you have a conversation, I was having a conversation with my husband about our roof safety because we're in Florida and hurricane season's coming up. And it wasn't long before Google and some of the other phone apps were popping up advertisements for roofers. So this constant information exchange is not just I'm going to send an email and someone can read my email. It's people listening all the time to everything you do, everything you say. If you have cameras enabled, then they're watching everything you do. So this is not to further the depression of the audience, but just to make you aware that there are things we do to make our information aware. There's things we do that we don't even know. If another example is Google Maps. If your phone uses the Google Map, then you can log into your Google account and you'll see all of your movements dating back maybe several years of where you've been, what cities you've visited, what shops you've been to. So this information is out there by our volunteering by social media, but it's also out there by the existence of all these devices in our environment. So what we want to do is control these things in such a way that they work for us instead of working to get information from us. So some of the types of information that's of interest from our perspective in terms of services have been evolving year by year and almost half year by half year. And this is just a snapshot of what was going on about 5 years ago comparing to what's going on now. So before around the mid-2010s, we had 4G ramping up, and most of the data was collecting traffic over the cellular phone for usually voice traffic, connecting people together, connecting with services, maybe maps and phone calls, sharing images, posting social media. And 3G was still in the background, contributing some of the data, and 4G was just coming online. But as we have gone on, 4G has begun to take over because of the need for this data, for all of the information that we need in terms of entertainment and communication through other means besides voice and text. So now one of the smallest data generators for a cell phone or a smartphone is voice. You would never see most young people, maybe under 25, most people don't communicate by phone using their voice. They're going to text or chat or get on some kind of Google Meet or some other infrastructure. Also, we have a lot of video streaming, and this was even before many people went home and were doing work using WebEx or other video streaming services. So that was already at 65% of the consumption of our traffic over this 4G system. So as we move into 5G, we have to be concerned with what kind of data is going out and how much bandwidth it's going to use. Streaming a video is going to consume a lot more traffic than using voice or even sending messages or using social media. And once we manage this video streaming, then we'll get into virtual reality where we have to send data about somebody's fantastical environment that they're trying to imagine and run a game with someone else. So now we're even more getting into more use of the bandwidth. So that's why you see the need for 5G, and we're already working on 6G in terms of how do we increase bandwidth and access to many people. You also see SpaceX working on putting thousands of satellites to provide some of this bandwidth and make up for the lack that we're going to have when people engage in these services. So having all this network access is wonderful. Maybe not having the network access. Our information is not so wonderful, but some people actually enjoy that because the network customizes services toward them. But it also brings a lot of security risks that most networking and computer engineering professionals are aware of, but many people who are trying to come into these IoT areas are not. So I'll go through just 3 different types of security risks that we see most popular cyber attacks. So the first one attacks basically the ability to access the network by taking over your system. We've seen several small cities or counties held hostage by these ransomware attacks, where another entity takes over their data storage, their file storage, their network, and won't release it until somebody gives some money. Then they'll release the information. But it takes a lot, it costs a lot to pay the ransom, and if they don't pay the ransom, they lose, decades of information because someone else has control over it. Another attack is called man-in-the-middle attack. So that means 2 people are communicating here. Adam and the gateway are communicating, and that's their intention. But someone can, some imposter can come into the network and start collecting information from both sides and sending information to both sides and pretending for Adam, this person pretends to be the gateway. For the gateway, this person pretends to be Adam. So now the gateway and Adam are no longer connected, and this person in the middle is controlling what happens with that data. So here's another version of it at the bottom right, that you're sending data and your idea is that you're protected through the firewall encryption, but this computer at the bottom is either collecting data or impersonating somebody and sending wrong data. So an example of this was the National Security Agency pretended to be Google and was able to carry on web page browsing and services as Google, but is actually coming from the National Security Agency. And then just, I think 1 or 2 more. So SQL injection involves trying to manipulate the user's website or the user's services by pretending to be someone else or just capturing some data and replaying it to pretend to be that person. So if the perpetrator can discover a vulnerability in what's happening between the website and the visitor, they can insert malicious script and steal information from that visitor. So a very simple version of this is just emulating a password, copying a password, replaying a password, and getting into having access to somebody else's system. So this happens all the time. I was a PhD student at Georgia Tech, and I got a letter some years later saying all of our records have been released out into the wild because someone got access to our system. And it happened to me as a member of the government. I had a secret security clearance for the United States government for some time, and I got a letter from them saying our records are now out in the open because somebody hacked into what we had going on. So it's something that we have to live with, but something we can also protect ourselves from. We can't rely on people to protect their systems or our information because it just comes too fast and it evolves too quickly. So we need a more automated way to keep up with these changes. And the last one is distributed denial of service that we see a lot of information about, how you have many different actors or one actor that's taking over many different machines to attack one location, and then you can crash a website or you can prevent services going out to customers by taking over. So this happens often as well, but in 2016, there were over 600,000 devices infected, and the East Coast was left without any access to internet. So as we go into this idea, and I'll go back to the first slide, this idea of IoT and having internet everywhere sounds great. All the physical world objects from your lamp to your refrigerator is networked. Then what does that mean for our security and making sure that we are able to manage what's going on in our environment? So advancing. Okay. So the challenge is the advantage, or is the the plus side is the minus side. So we want everything to be connected so it gives us more information and more customized services. But we want information about that information so that we can protect it. The decline of size, cost, energy consumption, all those things in the development of materials and computer architecture have worked to help this area, as well as memory use, computing infrastructures, communications, miniaturization of antenna, and the ability to use the cloud or the edge network for processing have all been helpful as well. However, when we adopt these networking and computing systems into new areas that are not prepared for the onslaught of information or the capture of information, then we have headlines that show up that are concerning, but these things can be resolved through some software-defined networking and automated network management in the background, as you'll see. So I'll talk about three main areas. First, I'll mention agriculture, then construction, and then I'll go last on smart grid because we have the most work in that area. So one example of overload that someone in a different application would face is just the many protocols that are available for IoT and being able to select which one would be best for their system. 6LoWPAN is pretty mature and has been developed for replacing the heavyweight IP protocol, but you also have LoRaWAN and Zigbee and some other Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, a lot of backbone communication systems that collect information for data that are options to implement, but you have to consider some of these networking and security aspects. Identifying your nodes with codes or RFID or URLs or URIs. Let's see, I mentioned the Zigbee. Also discovery of devices and being able to identify information coming from a device that pops up in your environment, or being able to set up a device to start collecting and disseminating information. The cloud database and backbone with collection through MQTT to an AWS database, for example, has to be managed and designed well for your system in terms of what size data, how often the data is being updated, and who needs to access this data. And the backbone coding and programming, JSON or other models, multi-layer framework, et cetera, all have to be considerations for your specific application and for your security requirements. So this first example is IoT in agriculture. So the idea in the top left is we have a farmer with a tablet that's collecting data from the agriculture around him. So there's wireless sensor nodes distributed throughout the farm, and this person is going to collect the data and make decisions about how to manage this area, from irrigating, whether to irrigate, whether to spray pesticides, whether to not irrigate because it's been raining so much, so if you irrigate too much, you can cause mold and other fungus to grow, and watching things over time so that when the next season comes around, remembering what happened last year so that you can either repeat a good process or avoid a wrong decision. So this data is being collected and aggregated and stored in a cloud system somewhere. So this information is advantageous to the farmer, but how much does this farmer know about how to use the system? How does the farmer know about the technology involved in order to get a system like this set up and in order to get a system deployed and operational in such a way that they can use it easy? They don't want to become a programmer. They don't want to become a network expert. They have an expertise already and would like to be able to use this system securely. So on the bottom right, you see a test bed we set up at the University of Florida, and I have more information on the next slide. Just to set up such a system, this one was strictly weather monitoring and determining wetness of the field. But this is a strawberry field with a tree barrier. We placed sensors in different locations to determine the weather and give updates to the weather. They were using Zigbee to hop back to the original transmitter and the wireless router to the gateway. The gateway went to Wi-Fi, and then we were connected into the normal UF network through the internet. So recent challenges as an example of why this is an important application. We've seen the studies come out about romaine lettuce being contaminated in a certain warehouse from a certain manufacturer, and we can maybe throw away all of that lettuce from that manufacturer. But if we knew more information using our Internet of Things system, we may not have to throw out everything from that manufacturer. We may be able to determine not only on what dates were these packages made, but we may be able to zero in on maybe a portion of the farm where this lettuce was harvested that caused the problem for the E. coli. And so we don't end up destroying entire month worth of productivity on this particular agricultural company's output. We only use our information system to pinpoint where exactly these offenses occurred. Other experiments we did, this is, as I mentioned, a little bit more detail. We were out at the Gulf Coast Research and Education Center in Balm, Florida. We were able to, in an IoT sense, there are weather stations that we can spend up to $600 to $1,000 to figure out what is going to be the weather in this county of Florida or this large region of Florida. We can supplement that by using tiny weather stations. If you see this pole, the white pole sticking up in the middle of the figure, that's a weather station made by my PhD student who's taking a lot of these same measurements but doing it on a micro level and using this IoT approach to find out in this particular row, in this particular 3 rows or 10 rows of this farm, what were the water conditions, what was the weather in terms of humidity, and studies have been shown to link leaf wetness, for example, to mold, which links to a certain fungus, which links to causing certain sicknesses and also even to certain cancers in people later on down the line. So that's something that can be traced using this information system. So in this example, we use these weather stations at different locations and try to figure out if we can tell something about the field based on the data collection. So the 3 different locations were, I think this is shown here. One was off of the field itself in a tree barrier. One was right among the strawberry rows, and the other one was node C was right next to the $1,000 weather station. And by the way, our weather stations were only about $60 to make and deploy, $60 each. So this weather station, reference weather station, takes macro information, and we're adding to it the micro information of these different sensors A, B, C. And the data we retrieved was pretty good. We got, we were able to see some similarities between the more expensive weather station and the data we were collecting, and we were able to see a little bit of variation in terms of the humidity being observed over time and the percentage compared to other earlier events, the temperature changes, and observing at the 3 different locations, there's a little bit variation in looking at the humidity. So we know that by relying on the macro weather station, they're not picking up all of the data that could be collected in terms of the changes happening between the locations on the farm. This graphic shows leaf wetness duration. And leaf wetness concerns, as I said, mold and disease later on down the line. So just for this 24-hour observation, we can see some variation, again, between node A and node C in terms of how long are leaves sitting there wet. And this is important because if you're a farmer and you have to decide whether to water, or irrigate, if you can observe information that tells you these leaves on this side are a little bit dry, these leaves are node B, have a little bit more moisture, and they've been wet for a longer time, then you can make decisions to make sure your crop is safe and able to distribute. So again, we just formed these risk recommendations for fungal disease, marking the level of risk, comparing the reference station to our own individual nodes. So this was just an example of one experiment that we've been conducting at the University of Florida. But the big picture is to be able to use IoT as a feedback loop to ensure food safety and security. There's a term food security in terms of being able to get food, but by food security, I mean monitoring the safety of the food as it goes through the process. So here you see a number of processes an item may go through, from planting conditions all the way to something going wrong like E. coli and someone getting sick. But if we have a monitoring system where we're able to determine, okay, this is the area, these red silos are where these plants were collected. We can see the conditions under which they were planted and what happened when the plants actually grew, and these 3 red triangles of the growth level. Once they're harvested, maybe different plants are harvested different ways, and there are ways we can pick up on extra information from that harvesting process. Then they're stored in warehouses. They're sent to Walmart or Publix or Kroger or whatever stores you have. These may be treated differently at different stores. And then if something goes wrong and someone ends up in being sick in an emergency room and reports where they ate, where they received this product, you can then use graph theory to go back and trace all the way back to these planting conditions. But not only that, but in these manifolds and in processing, you may be able to use deep learning to now predict what's going to happen. So if I have certain planting conditions as a farmer, I have the information that if I go ahead with these particular conditions, I may have a recall on my hands a month from now. So maybe I'll wait, or maybe I'll wait for the crops to dry out. Maybe I'll water a little bit more. But all of the IoT systems that are collecting data can now be used to feed back to the original farmer to improve their approach. Okay, and so for security and human safety, we can also look at other areas. I mentioned I'll do agriculture, construction, and smart grid if I still have time.
Janice, just a quick break in. We have roughly 5 minutes, and then we want to leave the rest of the time for discussion. Okay? Thank you.
No problem. I knew starting I had too many slides, but I just want to raise some topics for discussion, so that's fine with me. So for IoT and construction, we have a different case. So it's not tracking a product from start to finish. It's now tracking immediate real-time reactions of human behavior. So in construction, this is a very serious area in terms of the workplace because, as you can see in this paragraph down here, 20% of the private industry worker fatalities are in the construction area. So one out of every 5 worker deaths is due to a construction-related incident. And it's not necessarily neglect. It's just a very dangerous business. And the fatal 4 scenarios are falls, being struck by an object, accidental electrocution, and being caught in between an object. And if you've driven by the highway when they're building new pieces of the highway or railroad or a building, you can easily see why these things happen. But we want to make sure that we create a safe environment for these workers so that they can operate without having to spend so much time focused on security and as well as doing their actual service there. So we just acquired an NSF project at the University of Florida with a professor in construction and myself doing the IoT systems in the background. We have some imaging, and Giuliani does both imaging and construction as well. This is coming out of the CNS and cyber infrastructure areas of NSF. But again, we're trying to build an infrastructure that can protect users through an IoT backbone system and a well-managed network. So if we collect a system of data from cameras, workers, equipment, UAVs, virtual reality, BIM models, then we can feed this into a system that can begin to predict when these hazards are occurring. And we can equip users with helmets that have vibrating sensors and cameras on them. So if a large object, for example, is swinging nearby, it can vibrate someone's helmet and get them to look up. Or if someone comes too close to the edge of a girder, then we can do the same thing. We can have something in their shoes vibrate, or something, an audible warning or something else to let them know that there are alerts that are happening that they need to pay attention to. It also allows a recording of data for a project manager to see what are the most hazardous conditions, where are my workers having trouble, maybe I can change the schedule, maybe the timing of different events is occurring that's not at a most advantageous place. So these are two ideas. Maybe very briefly, I'll just show an outline for Smart Grid. But Smart Grid is, again, you're taking a network and joining all of the sources of energy together in a metropolitan area, for example. But now you have to deal with the other network services problems I showed before. Denial of service, blocking out the ability to service a certain area, or man in the middle where you steal energy, or you can force entire areas to be out of service or to have blackouts by reporting incorrectly that there's too much power distribution. So that causes the feedback system to say, stop distributing power, and there's a blackout. So all of these different systems relate to the same issue of having a lot of these networks connected to devices and people that aren't used to these network security problems. The solutions we can find in many different areas, but we have CPS methods and network management through software-defined networking that can work on these issues and remove the problems from having to be solved by the actual workers and move it back to the backbone network. So that's my overview of my topic. Thank you for your time. And I'll stop here.
Janice, thank you. So I think we're going to go to panel mode, and we'll be fielding more questions from people. Maybe if I could start off with a couple of questions, and then we will start reading off what's in the Q&A boxes. So first of all, Charlie, any questions from you for our speakers?
Well, I had one for the first speaker. He talked about a number of different radars that are controlled, but I've seen a number of presentations on what I'll call Wi-Fi radar and positioning systems. Are those not regulated, or are they stuffed in someplace else?
Thank you very much for that question, Charlie. I think Wi-Fi being unlicensed, they can be used for by anybody. So there is no requirements on these things, and that's why unlicensed is very important. And there are great deal of opportunities in upper 95 gigahertz, which is undiscovered territory, really. And then you have the 6 gigahertz, you have the ultra wideband, and even the 6 gigahertz. Some of that application can exist in that realm.
Okay. So Bahman, there are a couple of natural questions that come to mind. I think in your presentation, you showed all of this new spectrum that's being allocated, some of it for license, some of it unlicensed. But, it seems to me that it's sort of a linear expansion. And if you look at the growth in traffic, the volumes, what I'm hearing from all of the carriers, it's close to 40% a year. If I look at the growth in IoT devices, it's somewhere in the high 20s. And so how do you make sure that we use everything possible to eke efficiency out of the spectrum that we have? Take into account the fact that things at high frequencies, millimeter waves, don't propagate very far, so they're useful for some things, not other things. The balance between licensed and unlicensed, so you can actually do local distribution. And lastly, I would say sort of experimentation with all of this. What are you seeing as the strategy within the FCC to grapple with these issues?
Thanks for that question, Adam. I think that's a very, very difficult question to answer, but I'll give it a shot here. I think we are providing a lot of spectrum. I mean, what we are doing what we have done in the last 4 years is a tremendous departure from what was done before. I mean, really, before everything was about 2 gigahertz of spectrum for all the stuff that we were doing. Now we are providing 21 gigahertz of spectrum, 1.2 gigahertz of spectrum for 6 gigahertz unlicensed. I mean, that doubles the amount of the unlicensed spectrum that existed before. And you have the high frequency bands, which, yes, true that they are going to have limited propagation characteristics. But nevertheless, I mean, this will enhance the capacity to provide high throughput, which does not exist in the lower frequencies. Yes, that would require densification of the networks, and that's if we need throughput, if we need more spectrum, these high bands provide a way to get there. It may not be optimal, but I mean it requires more investment. But that's one way of getting there. But in addition, we have also provided low spectrum and mid spectrum. You have the 3.7 to 4.2 gigahertz, which provides 280 megahertz of spectrum, which is tremendous spectrum, given where we were 5 years ago.
Yep.
So we're making quite a bit of effort to provide a lot of spectrum out there.
Yeah. So Walter Johnson has a specific question, and he says, if you look at the 70 gigahertz band and the planning for it, it is supposed to be shared. How is that actually going to work at these high frequencies?
I take it he's talking about vehicular radar band. Is that the question, Walter?
Let me see the following. I'm going to unmute Walter. Walter, if you could ask your question.
Yeah, I was interested that, if I remember correctly, there was, by the way, Bauman, you have to treat me with more respect now. I'm a member of the public.
Oh, it's nice to talk to you, Walter. Thank you.
So, but I remember that there was a 70 gigahertz announcement that you were looking to use it as backhaul for 5G, possibly, and that gets into the issue of use of radar systems by DOT, and they've been very conservative there. So I was interested in, we're going to get more, and in fact, Adam touched upon this, as we get more and more applications for a fixed amount of spectrum, we get more and more contention issues. So how are you planning to approach use of 70 gigahertz when we've got these sort of critical life and safety applications embedded throughout?
Well, I mean, I think this is what we do, really. I mean, you're familiar with the process more than me, perhaps, because given your background, and we try to do the balancing job that is necessary to cover the different vested interests that is out there, including federal and non-federal. So we are. I'm not sure how we are not going to do anything different than what we were doing before. And we have an open process, and We will evaluate the issue based on the facts and interests that are out there.
Well, I might throw one more stone at you, if you don't mind.
Okay.
Okay. The legato issue is still in the forefront. And there was an example where the FCC did everything according to the normal process. And in effect, I think we're still back to where we started from 5 or 6 years ago, with the federal agency saying one thing and the FCC saying something else.
Walter, that was not a fact-based debate.
I know that, but they never are, Adam. So is there any plan to coordinate? I mean, I can see the DOT getting very rigid on this issue. So I'm interested in terms of whether or not there's been overtures and, how do we, and I don't think this is going to be the only such issue, frankly. That more and more, as the federal and commercial interests merge, I think we're going to be stumbling over this issue again and again and again.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
if I can just say a couple of things, as you're exactly right, the demand for spectrum is growing exponentially, and because of that, we are going to have many interests intersecting, and this becomes a very difficult issue to resolve, as you mentioned, with respect to legato. And I'm not sure where we're going from here, honestly. So.
Okay, all right, that's an honest answer. Thank you.
Okay. Walter, thank you. Okay, let's go on to the following. I think we had a bunch of questions from Tim Zimmerlin. They were actually for Marty. And we're going to go back to those. I think, let's see, just hunting down the questions right now. Okay.
I think there was one about law enforcement.
Yes.
Yeah, which is, an interesting consideration, right? And I think, the way that I haven't had to deal directly with those types of requests from law enforcement for access to, information that's being collected through an IoT or connected device. But it sort of goes back to some of the other things I was talking about in the presentation in terms of a framework for risk management and best practices. So I think the real answer is you don't want to be doing a fire drill if you get a subpoena or some request from an entity, a law enforcement government entity, for access to the information. So you need to have a framework in place. That is, when that kind of request comes in, who's responsible on the front line for dealing with it? What other people within the organization need to be involved in terms of trying to sort of triage the request and decide what to do? And it's not always, just the legal department, because, there's information of your customers potentially, right, that is going to need to be potentially disclosed. So there's also some, philosophical issues that need to be considered. So having a framework as to how you're going to deal with it up front is really, kind of the first step. And then, of course, the second step is, just determining strictly from a legal standpoint whether you can resist the, request. The easiest way not to get asked, or when asked not to have to deal with it, is don't keep the information. So data minimization and really taking a hard look at what data you have and maintain will, what we find, get you out of a lot of the situations you might be in terms of that information being requested, because you simply don't have it. So, I mean, that's one, aspect to it. The other issue I just want to quickly mention is a issue that's been boiling for about 9 months, which is called SHREMS, and it deals with something called Privacy Shield, it's international data flows. And we had something called Privacy Shield, which provided a certification mechanism for international data flows from the EU to the US. And everything was fine. And then the EU authorities decided that Privacy Shield was invalid.
That was the EU court as opposed to the legislature.
Correct.
Yeah.
That it was invalid, and now, and we were sort of left with now an issue trying to figure out what to do, but the basis for instating Privacy Shield was, the federal government supposedly.
Yeah. So Marty, let me maybe switch subjects. It's another one of Tim's question, but it's a very good one in that case, and that deals with the fit for purpose of IoT. Yeah. Okay. And, the thing I look at is in long-lived devices like cars, if I put in an IoT device, what happens if it stops working? Who is liable? And how do I not get marooned as a customer?
Well, back to
yeah, it might be best to actually turn off video because it kills your bandwidth.
Standard contractual clauses that you can put into place. Data flow.
Oops.
In the contract that you've got, as for example, an IoT manufacturer supplying devices to an automobile maker for inclusion in automobiles, something like that, the right kind of contracts in place and having the right kind of provisions that require indemnity, limits of liability, appropriate reps and warranties, dealing specifically with compliance with legal requirements of these new and emerging IoT laws.
Yep.
So that's my advice. I mean, oftentimes, well, not oftentimes, sometimes, you're unfortunately dealing with all this after the fact, and then you got to try and navigate through it without having the benefit of, contracts and having thought through how you.
Okay, so we have a question from Janice. It's from Suresh Tangavel. Suresh, I actually took you off of mute. Would you like to ask your question? But I'm going to ask everybody to be brief because we have quite a backlog of them. So.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Right. So the question, Janice, is, you showed a slide on the IoT leveraged agriculture feedback loop. Just wanted to know if such a use case across virtually the supply chain, I guess, has been implemented or trialed anywhere?
Not that I know of to this point. It's more of an idea I've been working with just from my experiences with agriculture researchers at University of Florida. I think this is what's happening sort of in a manual style basis as people try to trace things through supply chains to find out problems, but I haven't seen any automated network traced information as of yet.
Understand. Thank you.
Okay. And then we had a question from Prasad Shaman. Let me see whether I can bring him to this live also or not. Okay. Okay, looks like that's going to be tough. Okay. Oh, Q&A. Okay, so let's see. I'm looking for Prasad. Okay, so this is for Bauman. Do existing 60 gigahertz waivers request exemptions only from the technical rules, such as high transmit power, or do they also seek novel use cases while remaining within the existing technical rules?
Well, I think with respect to 60 gigahertz, I think everything is open, but it would have to conform to all the rules, though. So if it conforms to all the rules, then there is no issue with the waiver. Now, if it doesn't conform to the rules, then we can take the facts, the novelty, and other consideration into our decision making. Did I answer your question correct?
Okay, I have a feeling. Okay, so Prasad is not live, but I have a feeling you answered the question. Okay. So I think, Janice, you had one from Tim Timmerlin, and he asked, what happens if you were to project the stuff that you showed? He said 60 years into the future, and I'm going to ask, what happens if you project it 10 to 15 years into the future? How much of a congestion and are we likely to see on the spectrum that's available to us, and how will all of this stuff really interoperate?
Well, I think the forecast is really positive in terms of the technology, just because, as I mentioned, all the materials development, the computer architecture development, even the network development is trying to push everything more and more local. So it almost seems like if there's an oscillation, everything was pushing to huge global systems. Now everything's pushing more towards local edge, satellite-assisted backbone systems. And as you get more local, you have more of an ability to manage what's happening and send everything to the backbone. So I think most things will be like they are with automated vehicles. So it sort of seems like a fantastic science fiction idea at the beginning, but then as all of these different engineers get to work on it, you have a viable system that will become commonplace. So I think it will be commonplace to have everything networked and sort of our rules governed by other things. One thing I show in my class is the movie Minority Report with Tom Cruise, because it's a good example of how all of this automation falls into the background and people take it for granted. Now, there may be some pushback, but I think things are moving forward from what I've seen, whether we want them to or not.
Okay. So I have to say, I wish we had another 10, 15 minutes. We're at the top of the hour. So what I'd like to do is thank our guests for being part of this. I hope our listeners found it interesting. And what we have been promising is that we will make the view graphs available. The share site isn't working quite right, but if you could please mail those to me, Charlie, and to Karen Panulo with the release slip, we will actually put them up on the website. So let me thank you for that ahead of time if you haven't sent your stuff in. And then lastly, let me say we still have 2 more days during the week and Saturday as part of the summit. I think you'll find tomorrow's program really terrific. We have 3 great speakers. So with that, we're going to close out the session. And thank you all for participating and being part of this. Thank you. And Charlie, if you have the last word, please go ahead.
I'd like to thank our speakers, and I'd also like to thank the people who have listened in. If you look at the program we have, there are a few more days that have some good talks, and if you want to pass the word to any of your colleagues, that'd be great. Otherwise, have a great day.
Okay. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.